The Great Pyramid of Egypt. Who built it? When was it built? Well, today, a returning guest has an updated version of his book, Forgotten Civilization, New Discoveries on the Solar-Induced Dark Age. Dr. Robert Schoch and talk about recent developments, and he builds upon his revolutionary theory that the origins of the Sphinx date back much further than 2500 BC. And what happened to the civilization that built it? Well, today we're going to find out. I'm Tony Sweet with Truth Be Told. We welcome back to the Truth Be Told studios, the one, the only, Dr. Robert Schoch. Hello, hello.
Hello, it's good to be back.
It is great to have you back. I'm excited because you always bring that information that we've sat there on the edge of our seats waiting for. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you being here. What we are going to have our audience do, people in the chat room, please get your questions ready. I call you my co-host because sometimes you have the best questions that anybody can ask. But we're here to honor our guest today, Dr. Robert Schoch. So tell us, you kind of re-released an updated version of Forgotten Civilizations. So tell us what's new, what's going on to get us all excited.
Okay, well, basically, Forgotten Civilization first came out in 2012.
Right.
And I talked about my work on the Sphinx, redating the Sphinx, how this had implications for pushing back the origins of civilization, really back 6,000 or so years.
Right.
And I talked about how civilization at that early period was probably decimated by some kind of natural catastrophe, which I speculate at the time was a major solar event. When I say speculate, I was using lots of evidence that I already had. But I put together this, should we say, picture of how civilization had its origins much earlier, based on my work on the Great Sphinx, based on the discoveries of Göbekli Tepe, et cetera, et cetera. But much of it, there were a lot of missing blanks, I would say. Part of it was, in hindsight, somewhat speculative, based on pieces of information, which all seem to fit together. And since I've been working on it for the last 9 years, since the first edition came out, so much more information has come out that corroborates the overall story, the overall picture. And in fact, there is not anything, and I mean this seriously, nothing that seems to falsify it or seems to punch holes in it. And I'm not just trying to say that egotistically. I'm a scientist. I'm a geologist. My PhD is geology and geophysics, and I am trained to be incredibly critical, more than anything else, critical of myself. So what we have found and what the evidence is that the Sphinx, yes, absolutely has its origins going back much earlier than 2500 BC. The typical Egyptological dating is that the Sphinx goes back to about 2500 BC to the pharaoh Khafra, which the second pyramid is attributed to Khafra. Well, that's a whole nother question we can talk about some other time. But the Sphinx sits east of the second pyramid. It was assumed it was also Khafra. We now have, I'm convinced, absolute evidence that the origins of the Sphinx go back to at least about 10,000 or so BC. So this is before the end of the last ice age, which ended abruptly and dramatically 9700 BC.
Wow.
By a solar event. We now have a lot more evidence for that solar event, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. And essentially, the early civilization, what I now call the early cycle of civilization, was decimated about 9700 BC. The subtitle of the new expanded revised edition, and for those who have read Forgotten Civilization and I'm not trying to sell books here, I'm trying to get information out, I really recommend the new edition. It's expanded, it's revised. There's another 150 pages in it, including an entire new chapter at the end, and expanded material throughout. As the science has developed, another 40 plus photographs included in the book on top of the original photographs. But the subtitle, and I'm glad you just put it up, is New Discoveries on the Solar-Induced Dark Age. When the first edition came out, I wasn't even talking about a, quote, solar-induced dark age.
Right.
This is actually something that my wife, the moniker, the name for it, my wife, Katie Ulysses, Catherine Ulysses, or Katie, who now shares the authorship with me, because she has contributed so much, she came up with the concept or the name for solar-induced dark age, because we kept talking about how these early civilizations were decimated at the end of the last ice age. We went into a dark period. Humanity went into a dark period, and it was a re-emergence of civilization around 4000 to 3000 BC. So you have this period from 9700 BC, end of the last ice age, for 6,000 years to about, let's say, 3,500 BC, when civilization re-emerges. So this incredible dark age, what we call solar-induced dark age, or for short, the acronym SIDA.
SIDA.
So we're talking about SIDA, and I present evidence for SIDA. I present evidence that, and yes, in fact, it was a solar outburst that ended the last ice age. I also want to mention that there's been a lot of discussion about the Younger Dryas. So a lot of people have heard about the Younger Dryas and the theory of a comet, and that's not the end of the last ice age, but that's 1,200 years before. I talk in the book about the evidence for and against a comet, and come down on the side that no, it was not a comet, it was another solar event. So we've had bracketed solar events, and I was already talking about this in 2012, but since 2012, a lot of research has now been done on the sun and astrophysics, and we now have direct evidence from beryllium, from carbon, isotopic carbon, from tree rings, etc., that the sun is much more unstable than anyone ever imagined. Even 10 or 15 years ago, there have been a series of solar events since the end of the last ice age, more minor than the one that ended the last ice age, but still we have that evidence. For instance, there was something called the Charlemagne event, which occurred about 775 AD, which if it occurred today would absolutely devastate us. So I talk about all of this in the book. Getting back to the Great Sphinx, for instance, something that has been discovered since the book was written is that the Sphinx was not originally a Sphinx. I'm glad you were showing the picture you're showing right now, because if you look at the head of the Sphinx, what do you see? It's incredibly small in proportion to the body.
Right.
I had said that long ago. So I point out long ago, as early as 1990, 1991, when I started my initial studies on the Sphinx. But now what we have evidence for is that it was a lioness. I had long speculated it might be a lion, but we now know that it was a lioness. And this is work that I've done with my colleague Manu Safzadeh and Robert Bouval, and we wrote a paper about it.
Wow.
It was a lioness known as Mehit or Mehit, and she was a guardian. She was a guardian of an archive, what was essentially a royal archive. Now, this is all new information since 2012, but what is not new information is that back in the early 1990s, when I say we, Thomas DeBecke, a geophysicist, and myself, we did seismic work. We found a chamber under the paws of the Sphinx.
Oh, wow.
This was always very mysterious. We now have hieroglyphic evidence talking about the Sphinx in the form of Mehit or Mehet, the lioness, and the hieroglyphs actually talk about the Sphinx guarding an underground ancient archive or chamber. So this goes back to all kinds of, you know, incredible evidence that the ancient Egyptians themselves, not in 2500 BC, but even in 3000, 3100 BC, when we have the earliest hieroglyphs, they are writing about the Sphinx. And they are writing about the Sphinx as this lioness who guarded an archive. And when you interpret the hieroglyphs correctly, they're talking about it being very ancient at that time. So this certainly corroborates what I've been saying all along, that the Sphinx goes back to this earlier period. I based it initially on the geological evidence of water weathering, precipitation, because the Sphinx, since the last 5,000 years, has sat on the edge of the Sahara Desert. My early work demonstrated how the Sphinx was weathered by precipitation, by rain, which had to harken back to an earlier climatic period. I initially thought it was only a couple of thousand years before 3000 BC, but now with other data, for instance, reinterpreting the seismic data,
Right.
I am very, very confident that the Sphinx's origins as a lioness goes back 12,000 or so years. Give you another piece of new evidence.
Sure.
We have evidence of plasma strikes, vitrification on the Giza Plateau. Now, what am I talking about? When I'm talking about plasma, I'm talking about electrically charged particles that were thrown off, to be very colloquial, by the sun during a major solar outburst. And some of these will hit Earth. They'll come down as huge, essentially what would look like huge lightning strikes. And this was first discussed by, unfortunately, he's deceased now, by a very good astrophysicist, Thomas Gold. And he talked about how this was a possibility. He had found evidence of vitrification. Vitrification means glass, turning stone to glass when it's hit by intense heat and pressure, by essentially charged particles, electrons and protons and whatnot, coming down in the case of a major outburst from the sun, that it will vitrify the rock. It will melt the surface, and then it recongeals as glass. We have direct evidence now of this on the Giza Plateau. And I've traveled there a number of times. When I take people there, I can show it to them right on site. We have evidence that the Sphinx itself was hit by a, quote, lightning bolt, but not just an atmospheric lightning bolt. I am convinced this has to go back to that early period. There's something known as the inventory stela, which is an ancient Egyptian inscription that was found on the Giza Plateau, and it talks about the Sphinx having been hit by a huge, what they called a thunderbolt or lightning. And it talks about this having occurred well before the time of Khufu, who was the pharaoh who is reputed to have built the Great Pyramid. According to standard Egyptology, this doesn't make any sense, because supposedly the Sphinx was built after the Great Pyramid was built. But the inscription is very clear that the Sphinx was much older. It was hit by lightning. This was, for a long time, and still is by some Egyptologists, simply dismissed as sort of, ancient Egyptian myth to make the Sphinx seem more venerable than it really was, and, part of their religious mythology. But no, we're finding evidence that it's absolutely the case. So there's a lot of work on the Sphinx. I talk about Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey and new developments there. For instance, the concept that they were literate, they were having writing. And what you're showing right now is underground, one of the underground cities in Cappadocia, which I talk about in the book too, have been there a number of times. Katie and I have visited and explored those. Why did they build these underground cities?
Is fascinating.
Well, because of the solar outbursts. How do you escape from what was happening on the surface? You go underground. And I've spoken to so many physicists and talked about, well, how would you escape this trauma, the radiation that would be on the surface, for instance, the lightning, what would seem like huge lightning bolts, uh, just really havoc on the surface. Well, the best way is to go underground. In fact, some people are making preparations along those lines today because right now we have a very unstable sun. We have a sun that is more unstable now than it has been for 10,000 plus years. That's another thing. The sun seems to go through cycles of stability and instability, and I talk about that in the book. So there's just I'm hitting a few major developments. There's so much that has developed since the first edition of the book that I try to include in this edition, and it really makes, to me, a very satisfying, comprehensive whole, WHOLE, a comprehensive and complete picture of what was going on. So I feel really confident and comfortable that we are on the right track. And the sun has plays an incredible role in all of this, of what's happening on Earth and what happens to civilization. And I'll just say one quick comment right now. We, as a modern civilization, are incredibly vulnerable to solar activity, just as that ancient cycle of civilization was ultimately vulnerable to solar activity. We're probably more vulnerable than any of the ancient civilizations. So it's forgotten civilization. I talk mostly about ancient civilization, those very early ancient civilizations, but I also include quite a bit of information that's applicable to us today as we face the future, especially increased, we'll call it unusual or anomalous solar activity. So I don't know, I don't know if that gives a little feel for some of the things that are in the book and developments. I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Yeah, I was hoping you would read lips, but maybe not. But no, I we've heard several times over my lifetime how, tomorrow there's going to be a solar flare and it can affect our grids, it can affect our electrical devices. Give us an example of what you're talking about, because this, like you're saying, this could have helped end the age of the ice age. How would that affect these solar storms, solar flares affect an end to a civilization or an end to an ice age?
What we see at the end of the last ice age, 9700 BC, there was a major solar outburst. So it would have included solar flares. It would have included what are known as coronal mass ejections, proton events, what people refer to as EMPs, electromagnetic pulses, etc. And what this did, and we see the very direct evidence in the geological and archaeological record, what it did was it really snapped us out of the last ice age. It changed climate dramatically. You can think of lightning, huge lightning bolts hitting the surface of the earth, or think of it as sort of fire coming down and hitting the earth in some places. This would melt glaciers in some cases instantaneously. Where it hit water, it would evaporate water. So what you have is two things along those lines. One, with melting glaciers, dramatic melting of glaciers, where does that water go? It ultimately ends up in the oceans, and we have dramatic rises in sea levels on the order of 100, 120 meters ultimately. We have incredible amount of moisture in the atmosphere at that time, and this ends up torrential rains that causes flash flooding and flooding on the surface. Because when you have a lot of rain in a very, very short period of time, it doesn't soak in, and especially when you're talking about regions that did not experience that type of weather. Think about the Sphinx. Well, my early work, it really brought me back. I mean, I've been working on this for 30 some years now. The first geological observations had to do with weathering and rain on the Sphinx. Well, I'm now convinced that earliest weathering and rain on the Sphinx was probably from the end of the last ice age, these torrential rains that were going on. So you had torrential rains, which it would be incredibly difficult to deal with. Look at what happens when you have just even what I hate to say minor flooding. I'm a geologist, so what you have is in some cases minor flooding, which is really major from a human point of view. Something else that would occur is you'd strip the magnetosphere, you'd strip our shield, our electromagnetic shield, etc. It's been calculated that during a major solar outburst like this, you have increased radiation levels right on the surface of the planet. You have increased ultraviolet rays. You have mass extinctions at that time. So, for instance, large mammals could not survive. And we have, right at 9700 BC, especially in the northern hemisphere, and it seems to have affected the northern hemisphere more than the southern hemisphere, we have mass extinctions of large mammals. This is very well documented in the geological record, and they're not occurring at 10,900 BC, which some people try to claim, there was a comet then which started the Younger Dryas, and I can talk about that at length and why that evidence doesn't hold up. But this is at 9,700 BC, and it's actually, when you start looking at it, very logical. How can you survive what was happening on the surface? How can you survive intense radiation levels that were on the surface? And it's been estimated, for instance, throughout name of a colleague here, Paul LaVioletta, who's done work on this, and he's a physicist. I'm a geophysicist and geologist, but he agrees that in some cases, large mammals would not be able to survive more than a few days on the surface under these conditions without being able to find some protection, somewhere to escape to. We humans are large mammals. So this devastates human populations in some cases. So how do you protect yourself? Where do you go? How do you survive? Caves, underground shelters, rock is very good to help protect from something like this. So think about it. What were some of the animals that survived? It was mostly small animals that could go into crevices, go into cracks, could go into underground shelters. Humans in certain places could go into caves or start carving caves. In fact, archaeologists have been perplexed. Why, at the end of the last ice age, do you find artificial underground in rock caves type structures? Some of them are very narrow, they're very small, they're very cramped. They took a lot of effort to carve these out, but they would protect you. They would protect the humans, and you wouldn't need to go in there all the time, because these solar outbursts would sort of come in waves. But ultimately, they had to do something to survive.
Well, in fact,
and what I wanted to say is then ultimately this what do I want to say? The ultimate solution, if you would, was in part to carve into the rock, to find places where you could carve easily and to prepare if this was going to happen in the future. So you already showed a picture of the underground Cappadocia or Cappadocia. You can say either way, but underground Cappadocia cities that could hold thousands or tens of thousands of people. Now, these weren't carved overnight, but you have to remember that these solar outbursts would come in waves. And also, if most of your population got killed in one and they seem to be coming back, you would prepare in case they came back again. So I think there was this tradition that was instigated of going underground and preparing if this should happen again. Sometimes the analogy I use is during the Cold War. Well, what were people worried about? They were worried about nuclear devastation. Yep. So everyone started building bunkers and shelters, even in their backyard, to escape just in case it happened. Well, that was just in case. Who had dropped any atomic bombs? Just America a couple of times. I'm not making light of it at all.
But, no.
You know, it's not that it had even happened on a global scale yet. Well, this had happened on a global scale. So they knew that this could occur again. So there was this tradition going on. There's lots of evidence that these go back much earlier than archaeologists typically attribute them to. Give you one little tidbit here. For instance, when you carve out these underground cities, we can call them cities, in Cappadocia, the rock is actually fairly soft when you initially carve it, and then it hardens up. It has to do with the type of volcanic rock it is, volcanic layers and tuff stones, etc. Those are technical terms, TUFF. But you still have a lot of debris. Where is that debris going to go? You would have to bring it to the surface. You should have huge piles of debris all over the place. You don't find them. Well, why not? Because these are not just a couple of thousand years old. I'm convinced that a good chunk of them go back thousands and thousands of years earlier than the classic archaeologists suspect. And so these debris piles would have weathered away and, essentially blown away with the wind at this point. If they were only 2,000, 3,000 years old, you should still expect substantial piles. And these were not for comments. I just want to dismiss that completely. The rock would not tolerate being hit by physical impactors like that, but it will do an incredible job of protecting from what we would call lightning strikes and solar outbursts and high radiation levels on the surface. So
well, I have a question.
Let me let you get some comments in. I'm sorry.
Please, no. I
think it's important.
It's very
really important for people to understand this, because right now, those who are in the know, some people who are in the know, I hate to say it crudely, but wealthy people, certain governments, etc., what are they doing? They're preparing underground bunkers too. And I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist, but our electronics are going to go.
Oh, for sure.
And we see that on a regular basis, even with little solar flares that then correlate with, little problems with the grid system, or, a few communications go down for unexpected reasons. But Katie and I watch these things. She really watches these things. And, how many times, something happens and, a bunch of flights are canceled or communications go down in a certain region, it just happens to correlate with a solar flare or some other unusual activity. So if we get something, let me make one other point.
Of course.
1859, and I have a whole chapter on this in the book, Forgotten Civilization. 1859, there was a major solar eruption. It's known as the Carrington event. Now, when I say major solar eruption, I'm talking from a modern human perspective. It was very, very minor relative to other solar eruptions that we can now document in the sedimentary record, in tree rings, not even close to what you had in 775 AD. But 775 AD, I mean, they didn't have the technology we have now.
Right.
And not even a fraction of what you had in 9700 BC, which ended the last ice age. But there was the Carrington event in 1859. It's very well documented because there were what are now considered primitive, but they were sophisticated at the time, magnetometers that could measure the activity, geophysical activity, the solar storms, the weather to a certain extent. And in 1859, there were telegraphs. So people were starting to use electrical phenomena, electrical technology. The telegraph lines were fried. Telegraph stations burnt down. The magnetometers that were monitoring what we would now call the space weather went off the charts. If an 1859 event occurred today, or when it occurs today, it's going to destroy our modern communication systems. It's going to destroy our grid system. I'm not exaggerating. It is going to be devastating. Think about living without electricity. Think about living without electricity. You're not going to have water in a city. You're not going to have heat. You're not going to have air conditioning. Right. You're not going to have communication. You're not going to have transportation. All the electronic records could be destroyed. They could not measure it back in 1859, but there was probably what's known as a solar proton event that was associated with it, which would literally fry computers and cell phones, etc. Not just the satellites, which would be the first thing to be hit. Right. Cars to this day what are cars nowadays? They're really computers.
I was going to say it's computers now, right?
And some wheels. But we even know from the pandemic and how there's been delays in computer chips, that type of thing. So all of a sudden you can't produce cars because they're so computerized. We are so dependent on these fine electronics. And then there's a supply chain. And we've had really good examples of this just in the last few months, where the supply chain is being bottlenecked and we can't get things through. Well, this is just because of a little pandemic. I mean, think about if we have a major solar event and the grids go down, the communication goes down, and trucks won't start, and cars won't start, and you can't pump gas because you need electricity for that. I'm sounding like a terrible pessimist. But I think we have to be thinking about this, because all the evidence is that the sun, so if I could put it in the big picture, the sun, I'm convinced there's good evidence that the sun may actually go through cycles. We now know that other stars go through cycles. Other sun-like stars go through cycles. And some of those cycles, we have little 11-year sunspot cycles, and we have all kinds of cycles at different levels, different time periods. But one cycle that I think we might have to recognize, and I discussed this in Forgotten Civilization, may be about 12 to 13,000 year cycle, where the sun goes through a period of incredible instability and agitation, to be a little bit anthropomorphic, for a couple of thousand years. Then it equilibrates, goes back into a relative equilibrium, relatively calm, which doesn't mean you can't have some major solar flares and coronal mass ejections during that time period, but it's still relatively calm. And then it stays in equilibrium, but builds up essentially charges and agitation, then goes into a period of disequilibrium for a couple of thousand years before it then goes back into equilibrium for maybe 8 to 10,000, 11,000 years. And if we look at these patterns, we have a period, I'm convinced, of disequilibrium, agitation on the part of the sun that lasted a couple of thousand years, with a major event being in 9700 BC, which ended the last ice age. Then the sun calmed down, and we have, I'm not just making this up, we have lots of good isotope data that indicates this, because you can look at solar activity by the proxy of various isotopes and sediment cores and ice cores and tree rings, etc. So we have lots of evidence that the sun sort of calmed down for 8,000 to 10,000 years, but then started ramping back up just in the last few centuries,
Uh-oh.
including the Carrington event. So I think we're going back into this period, and this cycle seems to be the case. The end of the last ice age, 9700 BC, and we can date that very, very accurately using ice cores now, from Greenland in particular. So this is not just a made-up number. It's actually within 9700 BC, within give or take, essentially a few years. And the ice core data indicates that the ice age ended not over decades, which would be incredibly fast from a geological point of view. When I was a graduate student at Yale, we thought, if the ice age ended in 300 years, that was really fast. It was discovered 10, 15 years ago that it was within decades, then within 3 to 5 years. We now actually know that the ice age ended within months, possibly weeks, probably overnight with a major solar outburst. We can document this with what's known as microstratigraphy in the ice cores. So we have these cycles, and we have the sun was relatively calm for maybe 10,000 years or so, but it's ramping back up again. I also want to point out just one more thing, because I'm a geologist, so let me have a moment here.
You got it.
People talk about and I want to say this because some people have heard these words buzzing around. They talk about the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas is a cold period from about 10,900 BC to 9,700 BC. So what happened, to put in the bigger picture, is that the Ice Age began much, much earlier, 100,000 years ago. Yeah, I don't want to get into all the details of comings and goings of Ice Age. Just let's focus on the end of the most recent Ice Age, which is what affects us, our species. So the Ice Age was actually warming up a little bit. It seemed to be coming out of the Ice Age. And in 10,900 BC, there's this dramatic drop in temperature, a cooling, even by Ice Age standards. It lasts for about 1,200 or so years. And then it gets really warm, even warmer. So the drop in cooling is not as much as the incredible warming that happens in 9,700 BC. So cooling 10,900 BC, warming 9,700 BC. Now, there have been a lot of people who say, the cooling must have been a comet that hit. And they look at evidence and they see, there's vitrified rock and this and that. I'm not going to go into all of it. It must have been a comet that hit. And it makes some sense. A comet would throw up dust and debris, et cetera, et cetera. I was never, as a geologist, particularly convinced of the comet. And that's sort of where I left it in the first edition of the book. I am now convinced it was not a comet. It was the sun. And let me explain that, because it's somewhat counterintuitive to many people. What you had just before 10,900 BC was you had a genuine ice age, and you had major glaciers, but they were starting to melt, and there were huge ice dams, especially in North America, that were holding back huge lakes of fresh water from the melting glaciers. So this is something very well known. I studied this when I was a graduate student back in, I hate to say it, in the late 70s, early 80s at Yale. And there were the ice dams we knew eventually broke, et cetera. What the evidence is now is that they broke really suddenly. I mean, essentially overnight, 10,900 BC, and dumped massive amounts of fresh, cold water into the North Atlantic. This changed circulation patterns, and that's what set off the cooling. Now, how would this occur? I'm convinced that all the evidence, which I really can't go into here, is that there was a solar outburst at that time, which melted those ice dams, which released all that water into the North Atlantic, changed circulation patterns. And when you have a solar outburst, you're going to get micro spherules. You're going to get vitrification. You're going to get fields of shards of glass and that type of thing. You're going to get all the type of evidence that some people have attributed to comets. And the work that's been done in the last 8-10 years is looking at lightning and looking at lightning strikes, even in the modern day. And it's been found that what people had attributed in some cases to comets, shocked quartz and various types of vitrification, various types of geochemical signatures. No, that occurs with lightning too. That occurs with solar outbursts. Furthermore, in some cases, you might have what is now being referred to as essentially micronova from the sun. And in some cases, it will throw off little pieces and particles and whatnot. So even with a solar outburst, you can have, in some cases, some physical impactors. Furthermore, we now know that major solar outbursts, think of lightning strikes again, but it's not atmospheric lightning, will cause cratering. So just even when you have a crater, it doesn't necessarily mean it was a physical impact or a comet or an asteroid or a meteor that was hitting the Earth. And I just want to be clear, there is no doubt that asteroids and comets and meteors sometimes hit the Earth, but there's no doubt that solar outbursts occur too.
It's funny we don't talk about the solar outputs as much as and it's really something I think very new. I think we're going to be talking about it more as the future occurs, especially if we get hit by a decent sized one. Well, I think what
in the near future, which is quite. Yeah, and I don't want to be a pessimist. I'm not someone that's going to predict, you have to run for your life. And I don't have preparation kits to sell people. I'm not a prepper, that type of thing. But you have to look at the real data. And I'm a geologist, and what occurred in the past is going to occur again. There's little doubt about that. In fact, there's no doubt about that.
And I think we would have it worse because back in was it what is it 9700 BC?
9700 BC was the end of the last ice age.
At least back then, they didn't have the technology that we have now, and they didn't rely on it. So they lived off the earth and grew their own stuff, and they knew how to survive in the harshest weathers.
Yes, in the harshest. Now, the ones that were fried, so to speak, the ones that were hit directly or got caught in wildfires or flash floods or died from the high radiation levels, means especially if they're dying from radiation, they didn't necessarily know what was happening to them. So, I don't want to downplay that. What happened, and notice too, there's lots of different aspects to this. What survives from that really early period, basically megalithic structures, because that's what would survive, are things like Göbekli Tepe, where they were actively covering the site because there was all this commotion and catastrophes going on, and they covered it purposefully. This was not a site that was just filled in by dust blowing in like most archaeological sites. Göbekli Tepe is really interesting. We haven't talked about that to any extent yet because I am absolutely convinced, based on the radiometric dating, based on all the analysis that I and other people have now done to it and putting it all together, it goes back to before the end of the last ice age, the earliest portions, but it straddles the end of the last ice age. So at Göbekli Tepe, we have pillars that were literally broken because of the catastrophes that were going on. And I didn't mention it, but solar activity, and I talk about this in the book again too, solar activity is tied to earthquake activity. There's now lots of evidence that earthquake activity and solar activity are related to each other. And there's actually, without going into the great detail here, the Earth, Sun, solar system are all part of one major system. So yes, for a long time it seemed counterintuitive. People couldn't think, well, what could the mechanism be?
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, solar activity can set off earthquakes. In many cases, I'll use this quick analogy. People all know the concept of an avalanche, where avalanche is about to go, you clap your hands, and all of a sudden you have a devastating
Right.
avalanche. It actually works with I hate to say it that way as a geologist, but also works with mudslides and other rock avalanches, that type of thing. In some cases, they're just about ready to go. And solar activity will affect not just surface avalanches, but major fault zones that, yes, there's all this stress built up, and it just takes that little bit to set it off. And so we see increased activity. We see that in the geological record. We see that at Göbekli Tepe, where you have broken pillars that they tried to hastily re-erect, frankly, very crudely, but they wanted to at least get them back into position. And then they covered the whole thing over with soil and dirt and whatnot.
Right.
And the late Klaus Schmidt, Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who was the primary excavator of Göbekli Tepe, and I had the pleasure of speaking with him on site. Unfortunately, he died prematurely. He made the point in both his publications and to me personally that they spent as much or more time and energy trying to protect Göbekli Tepe during these catastrophic times as they did erecting it in the first place.
Right.
So, we have incredible evidence that these things were happening. But getting back to your point, we now are much more vulnerable with our electronics and our computers. I teach at Boston University, and I try to avoid this, but I have a cell phone.
Right.
But, so many of my students, so many people, their whole life is on a cell phone or a computer or in the cloud. That's all poof.
Right.
when we have
I mean, if you think about it, even
if we have even a moderate solar event, it's all gone. If we have a Carrington event, it's all gone. If we have an event equivalent to May 1921, there have been these events. The internet will go down. If we had one right now, we'd stop talking pretty quickly.
Well, let it finish our conversation first. But well, we have a lot of questions in the chat room. Do you mind taking a few from the chat room?
No, of course.
Well, I appreciate that.
I'm happy to.
There's some great ones in here. I'm gonna scroll up because there was one that really stood out. Cup of coffee. He asked earlier, and so. What role does plasma discharge play on genetics? Can plasma discharge really give rise to previous unknown varieties of organisms?
That's a really interesting topic, something that I'm currently looking into, because more and more I'm convinced that there's probably evidence of evolution. And so let me define my terms. When I say evolution, basically genetic change,
right?
That type of thing, correlating with solar activity, with plasma discharges. There has been experimental evidence that when you subject organisms to different electromagnetic fields, simulating some of what would happen on Earth, that yes, it affects the genetics. In some cases, it can cause reversions back to what seem to be some ancestral characteristics. In some cases, it can seem to increase fertility. Opposite can happen too. So this is something that we are just starting to explore that I think needs a lot more work, both from an experimental point of view and also looking at the data. I'm a geologist, so looking at the records of extinction events, periods where you seem to have genetic modification and what I'll call very rapid evolution, and how this correlates with solar activity and climate effects that were caused by solar activity. There's also been a lot of work, for instance, and I talk about it in the book, work on how background electromagnetic fields can affect health, can affect healing. And when I say healing, I'm not trying to talk,
Right.
what do they call it? What's this word I want? Uh, I'm not talking, I'm talking real healing in the sense of physiological
Oh,
healing.
okay.
I could put it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
Not woo woo. That's what some
Right.
call woo woo healing. But real physiological healing. Electromagnetic background radiation can affect how fast things heal. Can affect DNA. I can't go into all of it now, but studies of DNA and how it reacts under different electromagnetic fields. Even water reacts very much to electromagnetic fields, and the whole concept of, without going into great detail, water memory, that type of thing, which affects organisms. So this is a huge field. But yes, I have no doubt that when you had a major plasma hits on the surface of the Earth from solar outbursts and anomalous solar activity, yes, that affected biological organisms to a great extent.
Could that affect?
Did I digress from the original?
No, I think you hit it right on the head. But do you think that solar flares could affect I mean, not just the genetics of the human species, but change us in one direction or the other when it comes to, like, making a smaller species to protect us to get it? I mean.
Yes. Well, actually, what you would get, let me try to answer that quickly, is you would probably get a lot of different variation. What you would get is a whole lot more variation.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of those variants, so say the smaller, if that was more advantageous, they would be the ones that could survive longer, could reproduce, etc., if that makes some sense.
Yeah.
So probably, at least from what I've seen, with a major solar outburst like that, you're going to affect things all over the place.
Yeah.
And then there'll probably be all these variants, and some are going to do better than others. So then that's going to affect who survives and who carries on, etc.
I mean, that's
again,
the circle of life.
This is a field. This is something that I think is incredibly exciting to start thinking about and discussing, and needs a lot of work. And it's just one line of evidence and one line of research that we want to carry out further.
I agree. Well, Greg, he wants to know who buried all of the other tepe along the top of the fertile crescent, top of the wave mud flood.
Wait, now what's that question?
Let me see if I can read it a little bit better. So, who buried all of the other tepes along the top of the fertile crescent?
Okay, well, see, there's a lot of tepes that are now being discovered. So Göbekli Tepe was really the first major one. There's Karahan Tepe, and there's a whole bunch of others that are being found. So, something that Klaus Schmidt said, and when Katie and I were there, and he was still alive, he waved his hands and said, look out over the horizon. There's probably under all these hills other the archaeological sites, etc.
But Schmidt said it's intentional burial. This guy, he thinks it's a tsunami and sediment.
Oh, okay. So Katie's saying to me that she's looking at the chat room, which I don't see, talking about tsunami and that type of thing. No,
sedimentation.
That's
rocks, right?
Yeah, what Klaus Schmidt thought was that, and this is definitely the case with Göbekli Tepe, I can say that as a geologist, is that they were intentionally burying these sites. And I'm convinced that they were intentionally burying the sites because of the catastrophes, because of the unrest and geological unrest and climatic unrest that was going on at the end of the last ice age. Think of it as time capsules. I think they were maybe thinking as time capsules, not necessarily for us, thousands of years later, but I suspect that in some cases they thought they could maybe come back and, dig them out again, etc. What's the best way to preserve certain things? Frankly, to bury them when you're under such catastrophic conditions. Now, that would combine, I'll say as a geologist, when you have torrential floods and torrential rains, etc., you would get mudslides and movements of sediment naturally too. And you see this a little bit places like Göbekli Tepe, but so far I'm convinced that the primary evidence is that it was being done intentionally. I don't know if I'm answering the question. I'm not sure if I understood the question.
I didn't understand it as well as probably you did, so I'm sure you answered it perfectly. Well, time's getting away from us. I do want to ask one more question. Like I said, I interviewed Eric von Däniken about his latest book, and he talked about a friend of his that at 16 was trapped underneath the steps of the Saqqara pyramids and found these tunnels that, went for kilometers underneath the sand or underneath the terrain. So it actually what you're talking about, because I was thinking how would Egyptians in the middle of Sahara survive solar flares, or at least the civilization before the ancient Egypt that we knew. But now if they have these tunnels, it kind of makes more sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. So let me talk about that a little bit, perhaps.
Sure.
I don't know. I mean, how does he know it's kilometers if he was trapped there?
Right.
Yeah, maybe he walked for kilometers. Well, that's hard to believe, honestly. Right. And when you're in tunnels underground, you don't, it's very disorienting. I've spent a lot of time in tunnels and caves and whatnot. But let me say, honestly, that Sahara and Valley of the Kings, Katie just reminded me about that. These were sites where they were going underground. They were going underground very, very deep.
That makes sense now.
And what you have at Saqqara, let me mention Saqqara first. At Saqqara, you have under the step pyramid, yes, you have an incredible complex of underground structures. I have had experience with this personally, and I'm not going to go into great detail because some of it is confidential, to be honest. But I am speaking from experience, not just hearsay. And there are incredible structures under Saqqara. But something I want to point out is that not only are there incredible structures, but there are incredible stores of goods that were found by the Egyptologists, which even the Egyptologists admit some of these things that they found, like these incredible bowls made out of diorite and other really hard stone, seem to have been essentially museum pieces, if you would, or items that went back even before Saqqara, 2600 or more BC. More or less, these may have been vestiges that they were preserving and protecting and had saved from an earlier cycle of civilization. And in some cases, for instance, at some of the Saqqara items that were found, you have incredible craftsmanship on incredible bowls, etc. And then you have totally out of character with the actual object, this crude inscription in hieroglyphs dating from the Old Kingdom, third or dynasty or so, where they seem to have had something that was very, very ancient, and maybe they were labeled essentially this belongs to so-and-so, etc., but they were reappropriating it. They were appropriating these older things to themselves. And I'm more and more convinced, Katie and I have been looking at these types of things, that lots of things in Egypt, they might have New Kingdom hieroglyphic inscriptions on them, or Old Kingdom hieroglyphic inscriptions on them, but that doesn't mean that was their origin. They were being used and they were being reused. So the Valley of the Kings, Yes, of course, they were being used in the New Kingdom times, just like Cappadocia. The underground cities
Hmm.
of Cappadocia were being used in Roman and Byzantine times and maybe Hittite times. That doesn't mean that's the origin of them.
Right, right.
To this day, okay, just to this day, you can go to the Colosseum. Are you going to go to many parts of Europe where there are buildings that are not just hundreds of years old. We in America think hundreds of years old. That's really old. No,
Right.
there are things that are 1,000 or more years old. People are still living there. They're still using them. They've appropriated to themselves. So that's the type of point I'm trying to make. And yeah, Saqqara is a very interesting example because there I think we have very, very direct evidence that you know they were using and reusing things that were much older. Same with Cappadocia, probably the same with the Valley of the Kings, etc. And it's not uncommon that you use something for one purpose, and then ultimately people get buried there.
Right, right.
And I don't mean that in some facetious way,
No.
but even in the tradition of modern Europe. I'm a geologist, so when I say modern Europe, the last 1,000 years is modern Europe. Cathedrals are not primarily to bury people, but people are buried in cathedrals. So just because you find a body somewhere or in a pyramid or
doesn't mean anything other than
so-called grave, that doesn't mean that was the initial purpose or the primary purpose or the original purpose for that structure or for that underground cave-like structure.
Well, I've loved this conversation, and everybody in the chat room is loving the conversation. We should have a part 2 maybe after the first of the year. Come back and talk some more because you're just so fascinating. And thank you, Katie, for being a part of it too. I appreciate you.
Oh, I've been enjoying the chat room.
Yes, I thank you for being in the chat room. And we want to say hello to our good friend Brian Forrester. He was in the chat room earlier, so thank you for joining that part of it. But Dr. Schoch, people want to know where can they hear more of your lectures, anything coming up? Do they maybe go see you or find out more information?
So this is interesting because we're still in a pandemic. So I'm trying to figure out, when I'll be lecturing again, live in person, that type of thing. The best thing to do, honestly, is the website, robertschoch.com, all run together. So www.robertschoch, and so people know how to spell my last name. It's Schoch. So all run together, robertschoch.com, and Katie says she put it in the chat room. So we will be posting things as events start to come up again. I have been asked to speak at several events which are pending given COVID. Also, we hope to start doing tours again. So I hope to start getting back to the research in the sense of traveling, but once I can do that, I'll also be doing tours that are public that people can join us on. So that will be wonderful. In the meantime, read Forgotten Civilization, the new expanded and revised edition.
And we added so many photos.
Yeah, and Kay's reminding me that we had a lot of photos, 40-some photos,
New ones.
New photos. All the old photos are still there. So you're not missing out on anything with the new edition. The new edition is everything that in the old edition, plus much, much, much more.
If you liked it, give it a thumbs up.
And Katie says, if you like it, give it a thumbs up. Or
there
whatever.
you go, and leave a good comment. Good review. And speaking of
it
that,
helps with marketing.
It
5-star reviews. This is the way the whole world is now. Everyone, So
we need that here on Truth Be Told. Please, if you guys like this show, like it, leave a great comment.
Oh, wait. Katie says you need to link the new book.
Oh, no. He had the old one. Now he has the new one.
Oh, I switched it. Yeah.
Okay.
My fingers hit the wrong one.
Buy both.
Right.
Item, the old book and then the new edition.
Right. So, but we appreciate you both for putting this information out. We all loved it. Like I said, you're wealth of information, and appreciate you for keep doing what you do. And come back and see us. And if you don't mind sticking around afterwards, I just have a quick question for you. But
Sure.
for everybody out there, please leave a comment, share this show, click the notification bar below, and we have some great shows coming up next week and all through the holiday season. So, Dr. Schoch and Katie, thank you so much for being part of Truth Be Told again.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Of course, and
very much appreciate it. Thank you.
You got it. And anytime. So come back, and everybody, we'll see you next week. Don't forget, on Monday, you have Robert Hensley doing the Minuteman Report. And then Wednesday, if you like the Truth Be Told transformation, you like the spiritual metaphysical side of Truth Be Told, you got Bonnie Burkett. She was in the chat room today, and check her out. And then, of course, every Friday right here on Truth Be Told with Tony Sweet. I'll see you next time. Take care. This has been another episode of Truth Be Told. Thank you so much for watching. Recorded live at UBN Go Studios in Burbank, California. Join us on social media. Facebook, Truth Be Told Radio. Instagram, Truth Be Told Paranormal. Go to Truth Be Told Worldwide for more information on upcoming shows.